1796 came around and it was time to re-elect the president. George Washington, finishing out his second term, refused to run again for a third term. He saw that as being somewhat more dictatorial and an overstep of executive powers. So he bowed out. Very noble of the president. Okay, that's one of the reasons why George Washington is a great founding father and why he had a lot of foresight. Okay, and I mentioned in the last video his warning about the formation of political parties in American politics. Very, very bright and very insightful, and he lived a very colorful life. George Washington, if you ever get the time, read up on his life and his story, especially growing up in Virginia and his rise through the British Army and eventually his rise in the American colonies throughout the Revolution and on into being our first president. George Washington's a wonderful American. He's the face of the $1 bill. He's on the quarter. He's the face of our founding fathers. And hopefully will always be. Okay? But with the election coming up now that Washington is out, now you're going to have Vice President John Adams run for president. And who would be his biggest opponent? Well, how about somebody on a different political bent? Our guy Thomas Jefferson again. They're going to run for president. Okay? And in 1796, in a very, very closely contended presidential election, John Adams very, very, very narrowly defeats Thomas Jefferson. But, again, whoever receives the second most amount of votes automatically assumes the presidency. So you have two political rivals, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, one a Federalist, the other one more of a Republican, who have differing opinions, who are now in close contact with each other. It was not until the 12th Amendment, ratified in 1804, that basically delineated how vice presidents were selected. Okay, so no longer, after the 12th Amendment, would the vice president be the person who received the second amount of votes. Okay, but can you imagine that? In 1796, you lose the election very narrowly to your rival. Great. Now you're subjugated to that person. Awesome, right? That'd be like your enemy, your arch rival. You have some sort of election, and then they barely beat you, so they get to be your boss. That would drive me nuts. Okay? But otherwise, John Adams becomes president in 1796, and several different things immediately happen. In the very late 1780s, France, who helped us win our independence, thank you, France, had an inspiration because of the American Revolution. And they wanted to redefine what it meant to be French. And long story short, they declared a French Revolution in 1789 and immediately began a new process of reframing France in their new revolutionary image. And the revolutionary government was not necessarily very friendly. And one other thing that happened around this time is just before the election of 1796, I mentioned John Jay trying to patch relationships with Britain because they still had outposts that were seizing American ships in the Caribbean, and they still had troops along the Mississippi River. So John Jay, to avoid war with Britain, negotiates a treaty. And in John Jay's treaty, basically the United States settles our relationship with Britain. They're going to stop impressing American merchants into British naval service, and we're going to redefine some of the boundaries out in the western United States. Okay? In doing so, you somewhat stabilize relations, Jay's treaty with Britain. You stabilize relations with Britain. Furthermore, Charles Pinckney was also an American delegate who went to Spain to negotiate the boundary of modern-day Florida at the 31st parallel. So now you would have also the United States in partnership with Spain, who is in control of New Orleans and the Louisiana Territory around this time, navigation rights along the Mississippi River, which is the border between the United States and Spanish Louisiana. So the port of New Orleans, Mississippi River, the boundary of Florida and the United States. Spain now stabilizes a relationship with the U.S. So France, with its new revolutionary entity, does not like how the United States has befriended and stabilized relationships with its own arch rivals, Britain and Spain. So the United States is kind of buddied up with Spain and France, or Spain and Britain, and may not be the best of friends, but they're definitely on better terms. France doesn't like that. And France starts to seize American ships on the high seas in the Atlantic and seizes their goods and cuts off various different trading routes. What a way to punish somebody that you helped win a revolution. You are inspired by that country and you create your own revolution, and then you immediately cause animosity with that country that you first helped win independence itself. Oh, to be French. Oh, what a great story. Okay. In doing so, you basically have an approaching and impending war with France. Okay. Almost like a Cold War. We don't physically come to blows with France, but we are right there on the cusp. The Federalists in government want a war against France. They want to punish France for the atrocities of hijacking American vessels and doing all kinds of stuff and just being a terror on the high seas and being a terrible trading partner. They want to undo the partnerships and writings of their 1778 pact. The Federalists really want to hammer that point home. Cooler heads would prevail, though. That guy John Jay, who negotiated a treaty with the British, is sent to France by President John Adams in 1796. Or rather 1797. And he does so to negotiate how to calm the waters. France, you're going to stop harassing our ships. But upon arrival, the French delegation refuses John Jay. They refuse to see him. There are 3 French delegates who refuse to see him, and upon return to the United States, John Jay reports back to President Adams and says, I was refused by 3 French delegates, Monsieur X, Monsieur Y, and Monsieur Z. And it became known as the XYZ affair that almost sparked a war between the United States and France. And that just further emboldened President Adams and the other Federalists to want to go to war, but cooler heads would prevail. Okay? What it did, though, was it caused the United States to revoke much of the rhetoric that in rhetoric and laws of goodwill that they had written during the Revolutionary period in partnership with one another. So the Treaty of Alliance in 1778 was revoked. Now American vessels can capture French vessels. Essentially, you would have the formation of what would become the United States Navy during this time. And they got off to a pretty big start. And they did so by capturing almost 100 French vessels. That is too bad, Mr. France. That is too bad. Otherwise, though, eventually cooler heads would prevail when the first consul, who would eventually become Napoleon Bonaparte, agreed to a treaty with the United States that canceled old agreements and started fresh anew, and basically established new trade and commercial agreements that calmed the waters. So we almost went to war with France, but we came to a reasonable, peaceful end. Cooler heads prevailed. That also being said, the Federalists somewhat seem to have been divided amongst each other at times. A lot of them were jockeying for power, but one of the things that really drew the Federalists somewhat apart and kind of helped fan the flames of impopularity were the Alien Acts and the Sedition Acts, also known as the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Acts were a Federalist piece of legislation that wanted and aimed to curb immigration. So, new obstacles for somebody, a foreigner, who wanted to immigrate to the United States would now be implemented so as to curb immigration. Those are the Alien Acts. And the Federalists were very heavily in favor of this, and they wanted to curb that. The Sedition Acts were the ones that were more sinister in nature. The Sedition Acts basically aimed to prosecute those who spoke out against government. If you took issue with the government, that would perhaps be deemed as libelous or treasonous. Can you imagine that? Imagine if you were not allowed to criticize Donald Trump. There's quite a lot to criticize. Even if you're his ardent supporter, he's highly imperfect. Admit that. Okay? You're at least able to voice your concern with the president. If you were concerned with Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, you could say so publicly. Gosh, I can't stand that guy. I don't like this party. I don't like the Democrats. I don't like the Republicans. I don't support this, blah, blah, blah. You can say that. That is your First Amendment right. You're guaranteed the right to free speech. And as long as it's not perhaps threatening or violent, you have the right to say that you don't support President Trump. You have the right to say that you don't support the Democratic Party. You have the right to support or the right to say what you need to say. The Sedition Acts were a move by the Federalist Party to squelch Republican opposition. They wanted to stifle Republican speech and rhetoric, and they wanted to reduce their power and increase their own power. It was a power play by the Federalist power, essentially to destroy the Republican Party. But it had kind of an opposite effect, because President Adams, who was a Federalist, recognized that, first of all, you're upsetting a lot of foreigners who want to immigrate to the United States, and a lot of foreigners who are already in the United States are leaving. That's hurting trade cause. So we kind of need to leave that alone. These Sedition Acts are seen exactly as what they are. They're power plays by the Federalists to reduce Republican speech and to squelch them. That's unconstitutional. So eventually, the Alien and Sedition Acts would be revoked, and in reversing them, the state legislatures would eventually help the Republican cause to squelch the idea of Federalists overstepping their bounds. The Federalists began to be the very people that revolutionary Americans feared. Their thirst for power started to overstep and become a little bit tyrannical, and the Alien and Sedition Acts were deemed as such perfect example. So you do have some Republicans like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison who take the John Locke theory and add it to the 10th Amendment, which basically gives powers not explicitly granted to the federal government unto states. If things are unclear, let the states make various different rights. Those are known as the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, and those are deemed as having reversed the Alien and Sedition Acts within those. Okay. Further undoing of the Federalist Party came in the 1800 election. John Adams ran for re-election for a second term, but he was not a very strong candidate. Okay, he was not very well liked. And for all his help in helping America obtain independence and his work as a founding father, John Adams was not a strong president. And the American public saw that as much. And they saw the Federalist entity party basically start to crumble. Thomas Jefferson, in a very narrow election, receives the most votes, popularity-wise. But in the Electoral College, he actually, perhaps, if there was one holdout, he would actually tie New Yorker Aaron Burr, so as to effectively negotiate that last vote going to Thomas Jefferson. Congress would have to vote who would be president to receive that vote. And our guy, Alexander Hamilton, the writer of the Federalist Papers and the father of our central bank, even though he was at political odds with Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton being a strong and staunch Federalist and Jefferson being a Republican, Alexander Hamilton lobbied for Thomas Jefferson against Aaron Burr. And various different reasons why. Part of the different reason was Alexander Hamilton felt that Thomas Jefferson would be a more stable presence in American politics. He never trusted Aaron Burr. They had kind of a frenemy type relationship throughout their political careers, and they were often at odds with one another, especially because Aaron Burr was also a Republican, and Alexander Hamilton being a staunch, centralized Federalist. They were at political odds. But even though Hamilton was at odds with Thomas Jefferson, he deemed Jefferson being more stable and more trustworthy. So, if you're going to have a Republican as president, go with the enemy you know as opposed to the one you don't. So, Alexander Hamilton openly lobbies Congress to place that last vote in the 1800 election for Thomas Jefferson. And so, in that, Thomas Jefferson wins the election and would become president. In the last days of the John Adams presidency, you see Republicans take over Congress, and now a Republican, Thomas Jefferson, is going to be president. The last Federalist stronghold in American politics really comes by way of judiciary. They pack the courts, if you will. And that's one of the lasting aspects of the Federalist Party that makes a statement. But otherwise, though, the 1800 election redefined the directory of the American political scene. The Republicans would now take control of American politics. And you begin a Jeffersonian era of American politics at the turn of the century from 18th to 19th century. Okay? You saw a weakening of the Federalist Party and the Federalist mindset. Things would still have to give, and there would still have to be centralization, but, okay, you've got a Republican movement now. So eventually we move into Jeffersonian politics, and that guy, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, they have another falling out. We'll talk about that in Chapter 7.